For most, incest is seen as a sexual intimacy between anyone who is related by blood, like a parent and child, siblings, or cousins. We could even extend this to anyone who has a position of responsibility within a family, such as step-parents, step-siblings, or aunts and uncles who have married in. However, it was during the Middle Ages that the Roman Catholic Church became obsessed with the subject, to the extent that it even caused arguments between kings and popes. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Incest. Many forms of sexual contact that we regard as normal today were considered by the medievals as deviant. Sexual contact was for the purpose of procreation, needed to be between a husband and wife, and usually just involved the missionary position. Anything else was just sodomy, and the church became as obsessed with incest as it was with sodomy. Incest was first mentioned in the canons of the Council of Orleans in 511, and just 6 years later the Burgundian Council forbade marriage to a brother's widow, a deceased wife's sister, a mother-in-law, cousin, child of a cousin, an uncle's widow, or a stepdaughter. In 516, Vincomulus, the Bishop of Grenoble, was reported to his superior for marrying his dead wife's sister many years previous. Unsurprisingly, after being with his wife for 30 years, Vincomulus refused to divorce her. Nevertheless, the marriage was seen as incestuous and had to end. The case was a possible trigger for the church's interest in incest that followed. It was Augustine who arrived from Rome in 597 who was given the task of Christianizing the Anglo-Saxon pagans. The custom of the Anglo-Saxons to marry their close relatives bothered Augustine, and he wrote to Pope Gregory the Great asking for help with the problem. Augustine, who later became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, needed to know to what degree a Christian should be allowed to marry their kin. Gregory decided that it was not okay for any persons to marry who were related within the 3rd or 4th generations, a decision that he made based on both, quote, experience and scripture. Although he said that the English had so many of these cross-family unions, it was probably best just to warn them not to do it in the future because it was evil, but not to punish them for, quote, sins which they committed through ignorance before they had been converted to Christianity. Obsession. The medieval Catholic Church was hugely powerful and dominated the whole of European society in the Middle Ages. According to St. Augustine, marriage was a spiritual concept that actually altered a person, making their two souls one flesh, so religion was probably a factor in what became an obsession with incest. Although it was a way in which the church could assert its position of authority over the people, it may also have been a way of gaining more wealth. After all, people were more likely to leave their money and possessions to the church if they didn't have any heirs who could inherit. In the 9th century, the church in Europe had grown exponentially and now influenced the subject of marriage. The early bishops of the Frankish churches fixated on the subject of consanguinity, the state of having blood kinship with relatives, becoming more restrictive and ramping things up with incest laws across Europe. This meant that the prohibited degrees of separation in relationships increased from 4 to 7. So that meant no marriages between in-laws, members from a step-family, or second cousins. In 721, Pope Gregory II even issued a papal ban on marriage between those who were seen as having spiritual kinship, such as godparents. Actually, it was only when we reached the 12th century that the church finally came up with a clear view of what a marriage really was, what a couple needed to say to be married, and whether the marriage should be consummated to make it legal. Degrees. Perhaps it would make things a little easier to understand if we gave a quick rundown of the degrees of consanguinity and what they meant for the medievals. It is, of course, the first degree of consanguinity that is the closest, being a parent and a child. Second degree kinships are between siblings, and third are uncle and niece, aunt and nephew, with fourth degree being first cousins. Fifth includes great-grandnephews, nieces, aunts and uncles. Sixth, second cousins, and seventh, second cousins once removed. Now that we've cleared that up, you really have no excuse. Degrees of separation were calculated by counting back through the generations to a common ancestor. With marriage between anyone more closely related than a 7th cousin now prohibited, it was a struggle for the nobility to find anyone of their status to marry. Participating in a sneaky marriage behind the church's back would result in it being nullified. Trying to find a potential suitable spouse outside of the thousands that you shared at least a few genes with became harder and harder, and over the years many couples were given a handy dispensation from the church as long as the price was right. With these exemptions becoming more and more of a thing, Pope Innocent III reduced the degrees of separation back down from 7 to 4 again in 1215. Because finding more distant relatives to marry was often difficult and sometimes impossible. But that still meant being banned from marrying anyone who had the same great-great-grandparent, which covered more than just first cousins. A declaration of love. There was a marked increase in church involvement in marriage practices in the 11th century throughout Christendom. People were encouraged to build family trees that would prevent incestuous unions from as early as 948. But with the exception of aristocratic families, most medievals didn't have a clue who their distant blood relatives were. And many that married were oblivious to the fact they were related at some point in their family's history. In the 13th century, wedding bans began to be publicly announced declaring two persons' intentions to marry. This meant that others would have a chance to object to the union if they believed that there was any impediment that should stop a marriage from going ahead. Priests were also encouraged to carry out their own investigations into any betrothed couple's kinship. Papacy versus Monarchy. In 990, Hugh Capet, ruler of the Frankish throne, arranged a marriage between his 15-year-old son Robert II of France and Rosala Susanna, the daughter of King Berengar of Italy. But the union was not a success, probably because Rosala was much older, being 38 at the time. They separated after just a year, and then in 996, Robert married his first cousin Bertha, who was the widow of Odo I of Blois and daughter of the King of Burgundy. But Pope Gregory V declared the marriage to be invalid and condemned it because she was Robert's first cousin. Robert, who was a pretty God-fearing guy, was deeply troubled by this and separated from Bertha. The Pope gave him a 7-year penance for his sin. In 1004, Robert was married for a third time to Constance of Arles, but still hankered after Bertha because he tried to annul this third marriage and have another marriage with Bertha again. By this time, the Pope was Sergius IV, and like Gregory, he also refused the validity of the nuptials. A family affair. Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to Louis VII of France in 1137 at the age of 15. She was one of the most powerful and wealthy women in Western Europe. By the 1150s, the couple had become estranged. Coincidentally, Eleanor's relationship with her uncle Raymond, the ruler of Antioch, which was said to be one of excessive affection, wasn't helping the situation. Louis and Eleanor's annulment by Pope Eugene III was granted on the grounds of consanguinity because they were both descended from Richard II of Burgundy and his wife, Constance of Arles, making them fourth cousins. But just 8 weeks later, Eleanor married Henry Plantagenet, the future King of England, who was also her fourth cousin. Henry was similarly descended from Richard II and Constance. Furthermore, Eleanor and Henry were also half third cousins because of Ermengarde of Anjou, who was another common ancestor. So Eleanor was even more closely related to her second husband than she was to her first. Not to be outdone, Eleanor's first husband, King Louis VII, also married someone whom he was even more closely related to after their divorce. Constance of Castile was his second cousin, and they celebrated their wedding in 1154. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Even the marriage of William the Conqueror to Mathilda of Flanders was tainted by incest. They were said to be related within 3 degrees in 1051 at their wedding when William was still just the Duke of Normandy. Pope Leo IX, who wanted to flex his papal authority, prohibited the union, but they did it anyway and were put under an ecclesiastical ban. However, later, Pope Nicholas II gave the couple a dispensation and legitimized the marriage in 1059 if they promised to build and fully fund a new monastery. An abbey and nunnery were accordingly built in St. Etienne and St. Trinette and were consecrated in 1066, just before William set off across the Channel on his successful conquest for the English throne. Some rulers brought up the impediment of incest to get rid of an unwanted spouse. Most famously, King Henry VIII of England tried to use the fact that he had married his brother's widow as grounds for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Incidentally, Henry was related to every one of his 6 wives to some degree, but the Tudors are a little out of our timeline. Much earlier, in the late 11th century and after a 20-year marriage, King Philippe I of France had tried the same tack when he claimed that there was a degree of incest between him and his wife Bertha of Holland. Philip wanted to marry Countess Bertrade of Anjou instead, but the papacy and senior French clergy charged Philip not only with adultery because Bertrade's husband, Count Folc, was still alive, but also with incest. After all, he was related to the Count. The king threatened to throw the French clerics into prison. Philip and Bertrade married anyway, and Pope Urban excommunicated the king. After a 12-year fight when the couple separated and reconciled on several occasions, the French king finally gave in to the church and agreed to end all intercourse between them. Other instances of consanguinity which occurred during the Middle Ages included Alfonso IX of Leon, who married Berenguela of Castile in 1197. The following year, they were excommunicated by Pope Innocent III, even though their marriage had been arranged as a way of securing peace between Alfonso and Berenguela's father. The couple desperately tried to get a dispensation, but the Pope refused under threat of excommunication. Despite having 5 children together, the union was voided and ended in 1204, although they were able to establish their children's legitimacy. Richard III of England married his first cousin once removed, Anne Neville, as her great-aunt was Richard's mother. The famous Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon were second cousins, as they were both descended from John I of Castile. And finally, just one of the many intermarriages from the Habsburg dynasty involves Philip II of Spain in the 16th century. He had 4 wives. His first, Maria Manuela, was his double first cousin. His second, Mary I of England, was his double first cousin once removed. His third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, was only distantly related, but his fourth, Anna of Austria, was not only his first cousin, but also his niece. It was the Habsburgs' years of incestuous interbreeding that caused deformities in family members, and was probably responsible for their disappearance. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Have a great week. Cheers!